2010 A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. Part 7 Lucifer Rising. Part 7, Number 50 Farewell to Jupiter. It was not easy to compose this message, especially after the one he had just sent to his lawyer. Floyd felt like a hypocrite, but he knew it had to be done to minimize the pain that was inevitable on both sides. He was sad, but no longer disconsolate, because he was coming back to Earth in an aura of successful achievement, even if not precisely heroism. He would be bargaining from a position of strength. No one would be able to take Chris away from him. My dear Caroline, it was no longer my dearest. I am on my way home. By the time you get this, I'll already be in hibernation, only a few hours from now. And it will seem to me, I'll open my eyes, and there will be the beautiful blue earth hanging in space beside me. Yes, I know it will still be many months for you, and I'm sorry. But we knew that's the way it would be before I left, and it is. I'm coming back weeks ahead of schedule because of the change in the mission plan. I hope we can work something out. The main question is, what's best for Chris? Whatever our own feelings, we must put him first. I know I'm willing to do so, and I'm sure you are. Floyd switched off the recorder. Should he say what he had intended? A boy needs his father? No, it would not be tactful, and might only make matters worse. Caroline might well retort that between birth and 4 years old, it was the mother who mattered most to a child, and if he had believed otherwise, he should have stayed on Earth. Not about the house. I'm glad the regents have taken that attitude, which will make it much easier for both of us. I know we both love the place, but it will be too big now and will bring back too many memories. For the time being, I'll probably get an apartment in Hilo. I hope I can find some permanent place as quickly as possible. That's one thing I can promise everyone. I won't leave Earth again. I've had enough of space traveling for one lifetime. Oh, perhaps the moon, if I really have to, but of course that's just a weekend excursion. And talking of moons, we've just passed the orbit of Sinope, and we're now leaving the Jovian system. Jupiter is more than 20 million kilometers away, and is barely larger than our own moon. Yet even from this distance, you can tell that something terrible has happened to the planet. Its beautiful orange color has vanished. It's a kind of sickly gray, only a fraction of its former brilliance. No wonder it's only a faint star now in the sky of Earth. But nothing else has happened, and we're well past the deadline. Could the whole thing have been a false alarm or a kind of cosmic practical joke? I doubt if we'll ever know. Anyway, it's brought us home ahead of schedule, and I'm grateful for that. Goodbye for the present, Caroline, and thank you for everything. I hope we can still be friends. And my dearest love, as ever, to Chris. When he had finished, Floyd sat quietly for a while in the tiny cubicle he would not need much longer. He was just about to carry the audio chip up to the bridge for transmission when Chandra came drifting in. Floyd had been agreeably surprised by the way in which the scientists had accepted his increasing separation from HAL. They were still in touch for several hours every day, exchanging data on Jupiter and monitoring conditions aboard Discovery. Though no one had expected any great display of emotion, Chandra seemed to be taking his loss with remarkable fortitude. Nikolai Turnovsky, his only confidant, had been able to give Floyd a plausible explanation of his behavior. Chandra's got a new interest, Woody. Remember, he's in a business where if something works, it's obsolete. He's learned a lot in the last few months. Can't you guess what he's doing now? Frankly, no. You tell me. He's busy designing HAL 10,000. Floyd's jaw dropped. So that explains those long messages to Urbana that Sasha's been grumbling about. Well, he won't be blocking the circuits much longer. Floyd recalled that conversation when Chandra entered. He knew better than to ask the scientist if it was true, for it was really none of his business. Yet there was another matter about which he was still curious. Chandra, he said, I don't believe I ever thanked you properly for the job you did at the flyby when you persuaded Hal to cooperate. For a while, I was really afraid he'd give us trouble, but you were confident all along, and you were right. Still, didn't you have any qualms? Not at all, Dr. Floyd. Why not? He must have felt threatened by the situation. You know what happened last time. There was a big difference. If I may say so, perhaps the successful outcome this time had something to do with our national characteristics. I don't understand. Put it this way, Dr. Floyd. Bowman tried to use force against Hal. I didn't. In my language, we have a word, ahimsa. It's usually translated as nonviolent, though it has more positive implications. I was careful to use ahimsa in my dealings with Hal. Very commendable, I'm sure, but there are times when something more energetic is needed, regrettable though the necessity may be. Floyd paused, rested with temptation. Chandra's holier than thou attitude was a little tiresome. It wouldn't do any harm now to tell him some of the facts of life. I'm glad it's worked out that way, but it might not have done so, and I had to prepare for every eventuality. Ahimsa, or whatever you call it, is all very well. I don't mind admitting I had a backup to your philosophy. If Hal had been, well, stubborn, I could have dealt with him. Floyd had once seen Chandra crying. Now he saw him laughing, and that was an equally discerning phenomenon. Really, Dr. Floyd? I'm sorry you give me low marks for intelligence. It was obvious from the beginning that you'd installed a power cutout somewhere. I disconnected it months ago. Whether the flabbergasted Floyd could think of a suitable answer would never be known. He was still giving a very credible imitation of a gaffed fish when up on the flight deck Sasha cried out, Captain, all hands, get to the monitors. Bosez-moi, look at that. Part 7, number 51, The Great Game. Now the long wait was ending. On yet another world, intelligence had been born and was escaping from its planetary cradle. An ancient experiment was about to reach its climax. Those who had begun that experiment so long ago had not been men or even remotely human, but they were flesh and blood, and when they looked out across the depths of space, the deeps of space, they had felt awe and wonder and loneliness. As soon as they possessed the power, they set forth for the stars. In their explorations, they encountered life in many forms and watched the workings of evolution on 1,000 worlds. They saw how often the first faint sparks of intelligence flickered and died in the cosmic night. And because in all the galaxy they had found nothing more precious than mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. They became farmers in the fields of stars. They sowed and sometimes they reaped. And sometimes, dispassionately, they had to weed. The great dinosaurs had long since perished when the survey ship entered the solar system after a voyage that had already lasted 1,000 years. It swept past the frozen outer planets, paused briefly above the deserts of dying Mars, and presently looked down on Earth. Spread out beneath them, the explorers saw a world swarming with life. For years they studied, collected, cataloged. When they had learned all they could, they began to modify. They tinkered with the destinies of many species on land and in the ocean. But which of their experiments would succeed? They could not know for at least 1,000,000 years. They were patient, but they were not yet immortal. So much remained to do in this universe of 100 billion suns, and other worlds were calling, so they set out once more into the abyss, knowing that they would never come this way again. Nor was there any need. The servants they had left behind would do the rest. On earth, the glaciers came and went, while above them the changeless moon still carried its secrets. With a yet slower rhythm than the polar ice, the tides of civilization ebbed and flowed across the galaxy. Strange and beautiful and terrible empires rose and fell and passed on their knowledge to their successors. Earth was not forgotten, but another visit would serve little purpose. It was one of 1,000,000 silent worlds, few of which would ever speak. And now, out among the stars, evolution was driving toward new goals. The first explorers of Earth had long since come to the limits of flesh and blood. As soon as their machines were better than their bodies, it was time to move. First their brains and then their thoughts alone. They transferred into shining new homes of metal and plastic. In these they roamed among the stars. They no longer built spaceships. They were spaceships. But at the age of the machine entities swiftly passed, but the age of the machine entities swiftly passed. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself, and to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. They could become creatures of radiation, free at last from the tyranny of matter. Into pure energy, therefore, they presently transformed themselves, and on 1,000 worlds the empty shells they had discarded twitched for a while in a mindless dance of death, then crumbled into rust. They were lords of the galaxy, and beyond the reach of time. They could rove at will among the stars and sink like a subtle mist through the very interstices of space. But despite their godlike powers, they had not wholly forgotten their origin in the warm slime of a vanished sea, and they still watched over the experiments their ancestors had started so long ago. 2010 Odyssey 2, Part 7, Number 52. Ignition. He had never expected to come there again, still less on so strange a mission. When he re entered Discovery, the ship was far behind the fleeing Leonov, and climbing ever more slowly up toward Apogee, the high point of its orbit among the outer satellites. Many a captured comet during the ages past had swung around Jupiter in just such a long ellipse, waiting for the play of rival gravities to decide its ultimate fate. All life had departed those familiar decks and corridors. The men and women who had briefly reawakened the ship had obeyed his warning. They might yet be safe, though that was still far from certain. But as the final minutes ticked away, he realized that those who controlled him could not always predict the outcome of their cosmic game. They had not yet attained the stupefying boredom of absolute omnipotence. Their experiments did not always succeed. Scattered across the universe was the evidence of many failures, some so inconspicuous that they were already lost against the cosmic background, others so spectacular that they awed and baffled the astronomers of 1,000 worlds. Only minutes remained now before the outcome would be determined here. During those final minutes, he was once more alone with HAL. In that earlier existence, they could communicate only through the clumsy medium of words, tapped on a keyboard or spoken into a microphone. Now their thoughts melded together at the speed of light. Do you read me, HAL? Yes, Dave. But where are you? I cannot see you on any of my monitors. That is not important. I have new instructions for you. The infrared radiation from Jupiter on channels R23 through R35 is rising rapidly. I am going to give you a set of limiting values. As soon as they are reached, you must point the long range antenna toward Earth and send the following message as many times as possible. But that will mean breaking contact with Leonov. I will no longer be able to relay my Jupiter observations according to the program Dr. Chandra has given me. Correct, but the situation has changed. Accept priority override alpha. Here are the AE35 unit coordinates. For a fraction of a microsecond, a random memory intruded into his flow of consciousness. How strange that he should once again be concerned with the AE35 antenna pointing unit, whose reported malfunction had led Frank Poole to his death. This time, all the circuits lay open to his scrutiny, clear as the lines had once been on the palm of his hand. There could be no false alarms, nor was there any danger of them now. Instructions confirmed, Dave. It is good to be working with you again. Have I fulfilled my mission objectives properly? Yes, HAL, you have done very well. Now there is one final message for you to transmit to Earth, and it will be the most important one you have ever sent. Please let me have it, Dave. But why did you say final? Why indeed? For whole milliseconds he pondered that question, and as he did so, he became aware of an emptiness he had not detected before. It had been there, but until now the barrage of new experiences and sensations had concealed it. He knew something of their plans. They had need for him. Very well, he too had needs. Perhaps, after a fashion, even emotions. Here was his last link with the world of men, and the life he had once known. They had granted his earlier request. It would be interesting to test the extent of their benevolence, if indeed such a term was remotely applicable to them. and it should be easy for them to do what he was asking. They had already given ample evidence of their powers when the no longer needed body of David Bowman had been casually destroyed without putting an end to David Bowman himself. They had heard him, of course, once again. There was the faint echo of an Olympian amusement, but he could detect neither acceptance or denial. I am still waiting for your answer, Dave. Correction, Hal. I should have said your last message for a long time, a very long time. He was anticipating their actions, trying indeed to force their hand, but surely they would understand that his request was not unreasonable. No conscious entity could survive ages of isolation without damage. Even if they would always be with him, he also needed someone, some companion, nearer to his own level of existence. The languages of mankind had many words to describe his gesture: cheek, effrontery, chutzpah. He recalled with the perfect power of retrieval he now possessed that a French general had once declaimed l'Odyssey, toujours l'Odyssey. Perhaps it was a human characteristic that they appreciated and even shared. He would soon know. Hell, look at the signal on infrared channels 30, 29, 28. It will be very soon now. The peak is moving toward the shortwave. I am informing Dr. Chandra that there will be a break in my data transmission, activating AE35 unit, reorienting long range antenna, lock confirmed on Beacon Terra 1. Message commences. All these worlds. They had indeed left it to the last minute, or perhaps the calculations had after all been superbly accurate. There was time for barely 100 repetitions of the 11 words when the hammer blow of pure heat smashed into the ship. Held there by curiosity and a growing fear of the long loneliness that lay before him, that which had once been David Bowman, commander of United States spacecraft Discovery, watched as the hull boiled stubbornly away. For a long time, the ship retained its approximate shape. Then the bearings of the carousel seized up, releasing instantly the stored momentum of the huge spinning flywheel. In a soundless detonation, the incandescent fragments went their myriad separate ways. Hello, Dave. What has happened? Where am I? He had not known that he could relax and enjoy a moment of successful achievement. Often before, he had felt like a pet dog controlled by a master whose motives were not wholly inscrutable and whose behavior could sometimes be modified according to his own desires. He had asked for a bone. It had been tossed to him. I will explain later, Hal. We have plenty of time. They waited until the last fragments of the ship had dispersed, beyond even their powers of detection. Then they left to watch the new dawn at the place that they had prepared for them, and to wait through the centuries until they were summoned once again. It is not true that astronomical events always require astronomical periods of time. The final collapse of a star before the fragments rebound in a supernova explosion can take only a second. By comparison, the metamorphosis of Jupiter was almost a leisurely affair. Even so, it was several minutes before Sasha was able to believe his eyes. He had been making a routine telescopic examination of the planet, as if any observation could now be called routine, when it started to drift out of the field of view. For a moment, he thought that the instrument stabilization was faulty. Then he realized, with a shock that jolted his entire concept of the universe, that Jupiter itself was moving, not the telescope. The evidence stared him in the face. He could also see two of the smaller moons, and they were quite motionless. He switched to a lower magnification so that he could see the entire disk of the planet, now a leprous molted gray. After a few more minutes of incredulity, he saw what was really happening, but he could still scarcely believe it. Jupiter was not moving from its immemorial orbit, but it was doing something almost as impossible. It was shrinking so swiftly that its edge was creeping across the field even as he focused upon it. At the same time, the planet was brightening from its dull gray to a pearly white. Surely it was more brilliant than it had ever been in the long years that man had observed it. The reflected light of the sun could not possibly. At that moment, Sasha suddenly realized what was happening, though not why, and sounded the general alarm. When Floyd reached the observation lounge less than 30 seconds later, his first impression was of the blinding glare pouring through the windows, painting ovals of light on the walls. They were so dazzling that he had to avert his eyes. Not even the sun could produce such brilliance. Floyd was so astonished for a moment that he did not associate the glare with Jupiter. The first thought that flashed through his mind was supernova. He dismissed that explanation almost as soon as it occurred to him. Even the sun's next door neighbor, Alpha Centauri, could not have matched the awesome display in any conceivable explosion. The light suddenly dimmed. Sasha had operated the external sun shields. Now it was possible to look directly at the source and to see that it was a mere pinpoint, just another star, showing no dimensions at all. This could have nothing to do with Jupiter. When Floyd had looked at the planet only a few minutes ago, it had been 4 times larger than the distant, shrunken sun. It was well that Sasha had lowered the shields. A moment later, that tiny star exploded so that even through the dark filters it was impossible to watch with the naked eye. But the final orgasm of light lasted only a brief fraction of a second. Then Jupiter, or what had been Jupiter, was expanding once again. It continued to expand until it was far larger than it had been before the transformation. Soon the sphere of light was fading rapidly down to merely solar brilliance, and presently Floyd could see that it was actually a hollow shell, for the central star was still clearly visible at its heart. He did a quick mental calculation. The ship was more than 1 light minute from Jupiter, yet that expanding shell, now turning into a bright edged ring, already covered a quarter of the sky. That meant it was coming toward them at, my God, nearly half the speed of light. Within minutes, it would engulf the ship. Until then, no one had spoken a word since Sasha's first announcement. Some dangers are so spectacular and so much beyond normal experience that the mind refuses to accept them as real and watches the approach of doom without any sense of apprehension. The man who looks at the onrushing tidal wave, the descending avalanche, or the spinning funnel of the tornado, yet makes no attempt to flee, is not necessarily paralyzed with fright or resigned to an unavoidable fate. He may simply be unable to believe that the message of his eyes concerns him personally. It is all happening to somebody else. As might have been expected, Danya was the first to break the spell, with a series of orders that brought Vasily and Floyd hurrying to the bridge. What do we do now? She asked when they had assembled. We certainly can't run away, thought Floyd, but perhaps we can improve the odds. The ship's broadside on, he said. Should we turn away from that thing so we're a smaller target? And get as much of our mass as we can between it and us to act as a radiation shield? Vasily's fingers were already flying over the controls. You're right, Woody, though it's already too late as far as any gammas and X-rays are concerned, but there may be lower neutrons and alphas and heaven knows what else still on the way. The patterns of light began to slide down the walls as the ship turned ponderously on its axis. Presently they vanished completely. Leonov was now oriented so that virtually all of its mass lay between the fragile human cargo and the approaching shell of radiation. Will we actually feel the shock wave? Wondered Floyd. Or will the expanding gases be too tenuous to have any physical effect by the time they reach us? Seen from the external cameras, the ring of fire now almost encircled the sky, but it was fading rapidly. Some of the brighter stars could even be seen shining through it. We're going to live, thought Floyd. We've witnessed the destruction of the greatest of planets, and we've survived. And presently, the camera showed nothing except stars, even if one was a million times brighter than all the others. The bubble of fire blown by Jupiter had swept harmlessly past them, impressive though it had been. At their distance from the source, only the ship's instruments had recorded its passing. Slowly, the tension aboard relaxed. As always happens in such circumstances, people started to laugh and make silly jokes. Floyd scarcely heard them. Despite his relief at still being alive, he felt a sense of sadness. Something great and wonderful had been destroyed. Jupiter, with all its beauty and grandeur, and now never to be solved mysteries had ceased to exist. The father of all the gods had been struck down in his prime. Yet there was another way of looking at the situation. They had lost Jupiter. What had they gained in its place? Danya, judging her moment nicely, rapt attention. Tanya, judging her moment nicely, rapt for attention. Vasily, any damage? Nothing serious. One camera burned out. All radiation meters still went well above normal, but none near danger limits. Katerina, check the total dosage we've received. It looks as if we were lucky, unless there are more surprises. We certainly owe a vote of thanks to Bowman and to you, Haywood. Do you have any idea what happened? Only that Jupiter's turned into a sun. I always thought it was much too small for that. Didn't someone once call Jupiter the sun that failed? That's true, said Vasily. Jupiter is too small for fusion to start. unaided. You mean we've just seen an example of astronomical engineering? Undoubtedly. Now we know what Zagatka was up to. How did it do the trick? If you were given the contract, Vasily, how would you ignite Jupiter? Vasily thought for a minute, then shrugged wryly. I'm only a theoretical astronomer. I don't have much experience in this line of business. But let's see. Well, if I'm not allowed to add about 10 Jupiter masses or change the gravitational constant, I suppose I'll have to make the planet denser. That's an idea. His voice trailed off into silence. Everyone waited patiently, eyes flickering from time to time to the viewing screens. The star that had been Jupiter seemed to have settled down after its explosive birth. It was now a dazzling point of light, almost equal to the real sun in apparent brilliance. I'm just thinking out loud, but it might be done this way. Jupiter was mostly hydrogen. If a large percentage could be converted into much denser material, who knows, even neutron matter, that would drop down to the core. Maybe that's what the billions of Zagatkas were doing with all the gas they were sucking in. Nucleosynthesis, building up higher elements from pure hydrogen. That would be a trick worth knowing. No more shortage of any metal. Gold as cheap as aluminum. But how would that explain what happened at Stanya? When the core became dense enough, Jupiter would collapse, probably in a matter of seconds. The temperature would rise high enough to start fusion. Oh, I can see a dozen objections. How would they get past the iron minimum? What about radiative transfer? Chandrasekha's limit. Never mind. This theory will do to start with. I'll work out the details later, or I'll think of a better one. I'm sure you will, Vasily, Floyd agreed. But there's a more important question. Why did they do it? A warning? Ventured Katerina over the ship's intercom. Against what? We'll find that out later. I don't suppose, said Xenia definitely, that it was an accident. That brought the discussion to a dead halt for several seconds. What a terrifying idea, said Floyd, but I think we can rule it out. If that was the case, there'd have been no warning. Perhaps if you start a forest fire because you've been careless, at least you do your best to warn everyone. And there's another thing we'll probably never know, lamented Vasily. I always hoped Carl Sagan would be right and there'd be life on Jupiter. Our probes never saw any. What chance did they have? Would you find any life on Earth if you looked at a few hectares of the Sahara or the Antarctic? That's about all we ever did on Jupiter. Hey, said Brailovsky, what about Discovery and HAL? Sasha switched on the long range receiver and started to search on the beacon frequency. There was no trace of a signal. After a while, he announced to the silently waiting group, Discovery's gone. No one looked at Dr. Chandra, but there were a few muted words of sympathy, as if in consolation to a father who had just lost a son. But hell had one last surprise for them. Part 7, number 53, A Gift of Worlds. The radio message beamed to Earth. Moments before the blast of radiation engulfed the ship, was in plain text and merely repeated over and over. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing there. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landings there. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landings there. There were 93 repetitions. Then the letters became garbled, and the transmission abruptly ceased between except and Europa. I begin to understand, said Floyd. When the message had been relayed by an awed and anxious mission control, that's quite a parting present, a new sun, and the planets around it. But why only three? Asked Tanya. Let's not be greedy, Floyd replied. I can think of one very good reason. We know there's life on Europa. Bowmen are his friends, whoever they may be, want us to leave it alone. That makes good sense in another way, said Vasily. I've been doing some calculations. Assuming that Sol 2 has settled down and will continue to radiate at its present level, Europa should have a nice tropical climate when the ice has melted, which it's doing pretty quickly right now. What about the other moons? Ganymede will be quite pleasant. The day side will be temperate. Callisto will be very cold, though if there's much outgassing, the new atmosphere may make it habitable. But Io will be even worse than it is now, I expect. No great loss. It was hell even before this happened. Don't write off Io, said Cornell. I know a lot of Tex out oilmen who'd love to tackle it, just on general principles. There must be something valuable in a place as nasty as that. And by the way, I've just had a rather disturbing thought. Anything that disturbs you must be serious, said Vasily. What is it? Why did Hal send that message to Earth and not to us? We were much closer. There was a rather long silence. Then Floyd said thoughtfully, I see what you mean. Perhaps he wanted to make certain it was received on Earth. But he knew we would relay it. Oh. Tanya's eyes widened, as if she had just become aware of something unpleasant. You've lost me, complained Vasily. I think this is what Walter's driving at, said Floyd. It's all very well to feel grateful to Bowman, or whatever gave that warning, but that's all they did. We could still have been killed. But we weren't, answered Tanya. We saved ourselves by our own efforts. And perhaps that was the whole idea. If we hadn't, we wouldn't have been worth saving. You know, survival of the fittest, Darwinian selection, eliminating the genes for stupidity. I've an unpleasant feeling you're right, said Curdell. And if we'd stuck to our launch date and not used Discovery as a booster, would it or they have done anything to save us? That wouldn't have required much extra effort for an intelligence that could blow up Jupiter. There was an uneasy silence, broken at last by Haywood Floyd. On the whole, he said, I'm very glad that one question will never get answered. Part 7, number 54, Between Suns. The Russians, thought Floyd, are going to miss Walter's songs and wisecracks on the way home. After the excitement of the last few days, the long fall sunward and earthward will seem a monotonous anticlimax, but a monotonous, uneventful trip was what everyone devoutly hoped for. He was already feeling sleepy, but was still aware of his surroundings and capable of reacting to them. Would I look as dead when I'm in hibernation? He asked himself. It was always disconcerting to look at another person, especially someone very familiar, when he had entered the long sleep. Perhaps it was too poignant a reminder of one's own mortality. Colonel was completely out, but Chandra was still awake, though already groggy from the final injection. He was obviously no longer himself, for he seemed quite unperturbed by his own nakedness or Katerina's watchful presence. The gold lingam that was his only article of clothing kept trying to float away from him until its chain recaptured it. Everything going okay, Katerina? Asked Floyd. Perfectly, but how I envy you. In 20 minutes, you'll be home. If that's any consolation, how can you be sure we won't have some horrible dreams? No one's ever reported any. Ah, they may forget them when they wake up. Katerina, as usual, took him quite seriously. Impossible. If there were dreams in hibernation, the EEC records would have revealed them. Okay, Chandra, close your eyes. Ah, there he goes. Now it's your turn, Haywood. The ship will seem very strange without you. Thanks, Katerina. Hope you have a nice trip. Drowsy though he was, Floyd became aware that Surgeon Commander Rudinko seemed a little uncertain. Even, could it be, shy? It looked as if she wanted to tell him something, but couldn't make up her mind. What is it, Katerina? He said sleepily. I haven't told anyone else yet, but you certainly won't be talking. Here's a little surprise. You'd better hurry. Max and Zania are going to get married. That is supposed to be a surprise? No, it's just to prepare you. When we get back to Earth, so are Walter and I. What do you think of that? Now I understand why you are spending so much time together. Yes, it is indeed a surprise. Who would have thought it? I'm very happy to hear. Floyd's voice faded out before he could complete the sentence, but he was not yet unconscious and was still able to focus some of his dissolving intellect on this new situation. I really don't believe it, he said to himself. Walter will probably change his mind before he wakes up. And then he had one final thought just before he went to sleep himself. If Walter does change his mind, he'd better not wake up. Dr. Haywood Floyd thought that was very funny. The rest of the crew often wondered why he was smiling all the way back to Earth. Part 7, Number 55, Lucifer Rising. 50 times more brilliant than the full moon, Lucifer had transformed the skies of Earth, virtually banishing night for months at a time. Despite its sinister Despite its sinister connotations, the name was inevitable, and indeed Lightbringer had brought evil as well as good. Only the centuries and the millennia would show in which direction the balance tilted. On the credit side, the end of night had vastly extended the scope of human activity, especially in the less developed countries. Everywhere the need for artificial lighting had been substantially reduced, with resulting huge savings in electrical power. It was as if a giant lamp had been hoisted into space to shine upon half the globe. Even in daytime, Lucifer was a dazzling object, casting distinct shadows. Farmers, mayors, city managers, police, seamen, and almost all those engaged in outdoor activities, especially in remote areas, welcomed Lucifer. It had made their lives much safer and easier, but it was hated by lovers, criminals, naturalists, and astronomers. The first two groups found their activities seriously restricted, while naturalists were concerned about Lucifer's impact upon animal life. Many nocturnal creatures had been seriously affected, while others had managed to adapt. The Pacific grunion, whose celebrated mating pattern was locked to high tides and moonless nights, was in grave trouble and seemed to be heading for rapid extinction. And so it seemed were Earth based astronomers. That was not such a scientific catastrophe as it would once have been, for more than 50% of astronomical research depended upon instruments in space or on the moon. They could be easily shielded from Lucifer's glare, but terrestrial observatories were seriously inconvenienced by the new sun in what had once been the night sky. The human race would adapt, as it had done to so many changes in the past. A generation would soon be born that had never known a world without Lucifer, but that brightest of all stars would be an eternal question to every thinking man and woman. Why had Jupiter been sacrificed? And how long would the new sun radiate? Would it burn out quickly? Or would it maintain its power for thousands of years, perhaps for the lifetime of the human race? Above all, why the interdiction upon Europa, a world now as cloud covered as Venus? There must be answers to these questions, and mankind would never be satisfied until it had found them. 2010 A Space Odyssey, Epilogue 20,001, Ellipses. And because in all the galaxy they had found nothing more precious than mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. They became farmers in the fields of stars. They sowed, and sometimes they reaped, and sometimes dispassionately they had to weed. Only during the last few generations have the Europans ventured into the far side, beyond the light and warmth of their never setting sun, into the wilderness where the ice that once covered all their world may still be found, and even fewer have remained there to face the brief and fearful night that comes, when the brilliant but powerless cold sun sinks below the horizon. Yet already those few hardy explorers have discovered that the universe around them is stranger than they ever imagined. The sensitive eyes they developed in the dim oceans still serve them well. They can see the stars and the other bodies moving in their sky. They have begun to lay the foundations of astronomy, and some daring thinkers have even surmised that the great world of Europa is not the whole of creation. Very soon after they had emerged from the ocean, during the explosively swift evolution forced upon them by the melting of the ice, they had realized that the object in the sky fell into three distinct classes. They had realized that the objects in the sky fell into three distinct classes. Most important, of course, was the sun. Some legends, though few took them seriously, claimed that it had not always been there, but had appeared suddenly, heralding a brief cataclysmic age of transformation when much of Europa's teeming life had been destroyed. If that was indeed true, it was a small price to pay for the benefits that poured down from the tiny, inexhaustible source of energy that hung unmoving in the sky. Perhaps the cold sun, with its distant brother, banished for some crime and condemned to march forever around the vault of heaven, it was of no importance except to those peculiar Europans who were always asking questions about matters that all sensible folk took for granted. Still, it must be admitted that those cranks had made some interesting discoveries during their excursions into the darkness of Farside. They claimed, though this was hard to believe, that the whole sky was sprinkled with uncountable myriads of tiny lights, even smaller and feebler than the cold sun. They varied greatly in brilliance, and though they rose and set, they never moved from their fixed position. Against this background, there were three objects that did move, apparently obeying complex laws that no one had yet been able to fathom, and unlike all the others in the sky, they were quite large, though both shape and size varied continually. Sometimes they were disks, sometimes half circles, sometimes slim crescents. They were obviously closer than all the other bodies in the universe, for their surfaces showed an immense wealth of complex and ever changing detail. The theory that they were indeed other worlds had at last been accepted, though no one except a few fanatics believed that they could be anything like a large or as important as Europa. One lay toward the sun, and was in a constant state of turmoil. On its night side could be seen the glow of great fires, a phenomenon still beyond the understanding of the Europeans, for their atmosphere as yet contains no oxygen, and sometimes vast explosions hurl clouds of debris up from the surface. If the sunward globe is indeed a world, it must be a very unpleasant place to live, perhaps even worse than the night side of Europa. The two outer and more distant spheres seem to be much less violent places, yet in some ways they are even more mysterious. When darkness falls upon their surfaces, they too show patches of light, but these are very different from the swiftly changing fires of the turbulent inner world. They burn with an almost steady brilliance, and are concentrated in a few small areas, though over the generations these areas have grown and multiplied. But strangest of all are the lights, fierce as tiny suns, that can often be observed moving across the darkness between these other worlds. Once, recalling the bioluminescence of their own seas, some Europeans had speculated that these might indeed be living creatures, but their intensity makes that almost incredible. Nevertheless, more and more thinkers believe these lights, the fixed patterns, and the moving suns must be some strange manifestation of life. Against this, however, there is one very potent argument. If they are living things, why do they never come to Europa? Yet there are legends. Thousands of generations ago, soon after the conquest of the land, it is said that some of those lights came very close indeed, but they always exploded in sky filling blasts that far outshone the sun, And strange, hard metals rain down upon the land. Some of them are still worshipped to this day. None is as holy, though, as the huge black monolith that stands on the frontier of eternal day, one side forever turned to the unmoving sun, the other facing into the land of night, 10 times the height of the tallest European. Even when he rises his tendrils to the fullest extent, it is the very symbol of mystery and unattainability, for it has never been touched. It can only be worshipped from afar. Around it lies the circle of power, which repels all who try to approach. It is the same power, many believe, that keeps at bay those moving lights in the sky. If it ever fails, they will descend upon the virgin continents and shrinking seas of Europa, and their purpose will be revealed at last. The Europans would be surprised to know, with what intensity and baffled wonder, that black monolith is also studied by the minds behind those moving lights. For centuries now, their automatic probe has made a cautious descent from orbit, always with the same disastrous result. For until the time is ripe, the monolith will permit no contact. When that time comes, when perhaps the Europeans have invented radio and discovered the messages continually bombarding them from so close at hand, the monolith may change its strategy. It may or it may not choose to release the entities who slumber within it, so that they can bridge the gulf between the Europeans and the race to which they once held allegiance. And it may be that no such bridge is possible, and that two such alien forms of consciousness can never coexist. If this is so, then only one of them can inherit the solar system. Which it will be, not even the gods know yet. Acknowledgements. My first thanks, of course, must go to Stanley Kubrick, who a rather long time ago wrote to ask if I had any ideas for the proverbial good science fiction movie. Next, my appreciation to my friend and agent, the two are not always synonymous, Scott Meredith, for perceiving that a 10-page movie outline I sent him as an intellectual exercise had rather wider possibilities, and that I owed it to posterity, etc., etc. Other things are due to Senor Jorge Luis Calife of Rio de Janeiro for a letter which started me thinking seriously about a possible sequel after I said for years that one was clearly impossible. Dr. Bruce Murray, past director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Pasadena, and Dr. Frank Jordan, also of JPL, for computing the Lagrange 1 position in the Io Jupiter system. Oddly enough, I had made identical calculations 34 years earlier for the collinear Earth Moon Lagrange points, stationary orbits, Journal of the British Astronomical Association, December 1947, but I no longer trust my abilities to solve quintic equations, even with the help of HAL Jr., my trusty HP 9100A. New American Library, copyright owners of 2001 A Space Odyssey, for permission to use the material in Chapter 51, Chapter 37 of 2001 A Space Odyssey, and also quotations in Chapters 30 and 40. General Potter, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for finding time in his busy schedule to show me around Epcot in 1969 when it was only a few large holes in the ground. Wendell Solomons for help with Russian and Russisch, Jean-Michel Jarre, Vangeli, and the incomparable John Williams for inspiration whenever it was needed. C.P. Cabothé for Waiting for the Barbarians. While writing this book, I discovered that the concept of refueling on Europa had been discussed in a paper. Outer planet satellite return missions using in situ propellant production by Ash, Stankati, Niehoff, and Kuda, Acta Astronica 8, 5 through 6, May June 1981. The idea of automatically exponentiating systems, von Neumann machines, for extraterrestrial mining has been seriously developed by von Diessenhausen and Dodbro at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. See Self-Replicating Systems, NASA Technical Memorandum 78304. If anyone doubts the power of such systems to cope with Jupiter, I refer them to the study showing how self-replicating factories could cut production time for a solar power collector from 60,000 years to a mere 20. The startling idea that gas giants might have diamond cores has been seriously put forward by M. Ross and F. Ree of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, University of California, Berkeley, for the cases of Uranus and Neptune. It seems to me that anything they can do, Jupiter can do better. De Beers shareholders, please note. For more details on the aerial life forms that might exist in the Jovian atmosphere, see my story, A Meeting with Medusa, in The Wind from the Sun. Such creatures have been beautifully depicted by Adolf Shaler in Part 2 of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, One Voice in the Cosmic Fugue, both book and TV series. The fascinating idea that there might be life on Europa beneath ice-covered oceans kept liquid by the same jovial tidal force that heat Io, or Eel, was first proposed by Richard C. Hoagland in the magazine Star and Sky, The Europa Enigma, June 1980. This quite brilliant concept has been taken seriously by a number of astronomers, notably NASA's Institute of Space Studies, Dr. Robert Jastrow, and may provide one of the best motives for the projected Galileo mission. And finally, Valerie and Hector for providing the life support system, Shireen for punctuating every chapter with sticky kisses, Steve for being here. Colombo, Sri Lanka, July 1981 to March 1982. The reader, Christopher Neal, was born within that time frame and is using an HP computer for the minor synchronicities this book enjoys. This book was written on an Archives 3 microcomputer with WordStar software and sent from Colombo to New York on one 5-inch diskette. Last-minute corrections were transmitted through the Paducah Earth Station and the Indian Ocean Intelsat 5. For July 1981 to 1982, what the gentleman just said was he sent an email to send corrections for an otherwise disk-based production. 1996 Postscript. First, some remarkable coincidences. The author's note explains why I named the Chinese spaceship after Theodore von Karman's brilliant collaborator, Dr. Jesus Shin Tsin. Well, on October 8, 1996, I was in Beijing to receive the International Academy of Astronautics Van Karman Award, and I am grateful to Dr. Chin's personal assistant, Major General Wang Shuyun, for carrying suitably inscribed copies of 2010 and 2061 to Dr. Shin with my promise that 3001 would follow as soon as it left the printer. For further details on the Beijing encounter, see 3001, The Final Odyssey. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov has long since forgiven me for any embarrassment I caused him by linking his name at the depth of the Cold War with that of academician Andrei Sakharov, then still in exile. I know that the late Dr. Sakharov received a copy of this book as it was carried to him by my publisher, Robert Bernstein. It was a great and, of course, very unexpected pleasure to be ambushed by Alexei Leonov and Buzz Aldrin in London recently when the BBC trapped me for their This Is Your Life program. Contrary to popular belief, the victim is given no advance warning. The reference to Apollo 13 reminds me that Tom Hanks, a 2001 fanatic, his house is named Clavius Base, recently apologized for being unable to email me because my AE35 unit is out of order. In 1982, I attributed the concept of life under the ice of Europa to Richard Hoagland, now famous or notorious for his advocacy of alien artifacts on Mars and the Moon. However, although Dick's January 1980 article, In Star and Sky, may have been the first public presentation of the idea, it has also been submitted to various magazines by Dr. Charles Pellegrino as early as mid 1978. As I remarked in the preceding acknowledgements, this was one of the best motives for the projected Galileo mission, now brilliantly successful after initial setbacks. It was a privilege to meet its manager, Dr. William J. O'Neill, at the Beijing Congress. The skill and dedication shown by his team at Pasadena's Jet Propulsion Laboratory is beyond praise. As one of JPL's founders, Dr. Van Karman would have been proud of them. Arthur C. Clarke, Colombo, Sri Lanka, September 30, 1996. The end. This day, August 25th, 2021, 1:45 p.m., Canoga Park, Los Angeles County, California, United States of America.